First, exploration. What does a man learn when he watches a kingdom rot from the inside? There are truths that only reveal themselves in the dying light of empires. Montesquieu understood this. He sat in the parlors of the Ancien Régime, watching powdered aristocrats dance while the floorboards buckled beneath them. He saw what others refused to see, not because he was braver, but because he had learned to watch the way a physician watches a patient, clinically, tenderly, knowing that diagnosis comes before the fever breaks. And what he diagnosed was this: power, unchecked and unbalanced, doesn't corrupt gradually. It collapses suddenly, like a staircase whose rot went unnoticed until the moment of the fall. This is not a story about France. This is a story about what happens when men forget that every throne is made of wood. Picture him there, Charles-Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, in his chateau near Bordeaux. The year is 1734, maybe 1735. The vineyards outside his window are heavy with fruit. Inside, scattered across his desk, are letters from philosophers, travel journals, maps of empires he'll never visit. He's writing the spirit of the laws, though he doesn't know yet that it will take him 14 more years to finish. He only knows that something is wrong with the world, and that wrongness has a pattern. He's seen it in Rome. He's seen it in Persia. He's seeing it now in his own country, where the Sun King's legacy has become a shadow that devours everything beneath it. What does a man learn when he watches a kingdom rot from the inside? He learns that power doesn't want balance. Power wants more power. It wants to eat itself into obesity, into immobility, into the kind of grotesque excess that makes subjects look away in disgust. Montesquieu learned this not from books alone, but from observation. The quiet, patient kind that reveals the mechanisms beneath the spectacle. He noticed that in republics, virtue was the animating principle. Citizens acted for the common good because they believed in something beyond themselves. But virtue is fragile. It requires constant renewal, like a garden that returns to wilderness the moment you stop tending it. In monarchies, he saw something different. Not virtue, but honor. That strange aristocratic code that made men duel over insults and die for the king's favor. Honor was the oil that kept the machinery running, the thing that made nobles compete for glory rather than gold. But honor, too, could be corrupted. When a king started selling titles, when merit mattered less than proximity to power, honor became hollow. It became a game where everyone pretended the rules still mattered, while privately laughing at them. And then there was despotism, fear. The crudest principle, the one that needed no philosophy, no mythology, no shared dream. Just the sword, and the silence after the sword falls. Montesquieu saw despotism as the natural endpoint of unchecked power, the place where all complexity collapses into a single, terrible simplicity. One man rules, everyone else obeys, and in that obedience, something essential dies. Not just freedom, but the capacity to imagine freedom. The soul learns to flinch before the question is even asked. But here's what haunts the late hours. Montesquieu didn't just describe these systems. He warned that they were always shifting, always one crisis away from transformation. A republic could slide into tyranny if its citizens grew lazy, if they traded virtue for convenience. A monarchy could harden into despotism if the king forgot he was part of a system, not above it. And despotism, well, despotism carried the seeds of its own violent overthrow, because fear doesn't inspire loyalty. It only inspires the patience to wait for weakness. He wrote all this not as a revolutionary, but as a man trying to preserve something. He believed in balance, that ancient, almost mystical idea that power should be distributed, checked, separated into branches that could watch one another the way wolves watch wolves, not out of trust, but out of necessity. The legislature, the executive, the judiciary, each one a counterweight to the others, each one preventing the concentration that leads to rot. When you read the spirit of the laws now, if you have the patience to move through its dense, sprawling arguments, you realize it's not really a book about government. It's a book about human nature, about what we become when we're given power, and what we become when power is taken from us. Montesquieu saw politics as ecology, a fragile web of relationships that could be destroyed by a single invasive force. And he saw himself as a cartographer, mapping the terrain so that others might navigate it without falling into the chasms he'd identified. The aristocrats of his time didn't listen. They read his work, nodded politely, and went back to their salons. 50 years later, their grandchildren would lose their heads to the guillotine. The revolution Montesquieu feared and anticipated would devour the very class he belonged to. But his ideas survived. They crossed the Atlantic and found new soil in a country that didn't exist when he started writing. The American founders read him obsessively. They built a constitution on his bones. 3 branches, checks and balances, the deliberate friction that prevents any one faction from swallowing the whole. What does a man learn when he watches a kingdom rot from the inside? He learns that the rot is never sudden. It's always there, beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions. He learns that power is a drug, and those who take it can never take enough. He learns that the only defense against tyranny is structure, not the hope that good men will rule, but the certainty that bad men will try, and the system must be built to withstand them. And maybe, in the quiet of his study, with the candles burning low and the night pressing against the windows, Montesquieu learned one more thing. That diagnosis is not enough, that seeing the pattern doesn't stop the pattern, that all he could do was write it down and hope that somewhere, sometime, someone would read his words and remember what he saw. The kingdoms always rot. The question is whether we notice before the fall. Second exploration. Why do empires collapse the moment they believe they cannot? There's a strange mathematics to decline, not the kind you learn in ledgers or war rooms, but the kind that lives in the space between what a people believe about themselves and what they actually are. Montesquieu spent years trying to articulate this gap, this invisible distance that separates a living civilization from a dying one. He called it spirit, not the religious kind, but something closer to atmosphere, the collective mood that makes a nation either vigilant or complacent, either hungry or satisfied. And what he discovered, in his quiet, methodical way, was that empires don't collapse because they grow weak. They collapse because they grow certain, certain of their strength, certain of their permanence, certain that the rules of decay don't apply to them. Think of Rome, not the Rome of gladiators and conquest, but the later Rome, the one that stopped building and started administering, the one where citizens became subjects, where the army filled with mercenaries who fought for coin instead of country. Montesquieu looked at Rome and saw a pattern. Empires expand until they can't, and then they maintain until they can't, and then they contract until there's nothing left to contract. But the contraction doesn't start with invasion or famine. It starts with belief, with the creeping sense that the old virtues, discipline, sacrifice, civic duty, are quaint relics for a softer, easier time. He saw the same pattern in Persia, in the great dynasties of the East, where despotism had calcified into ritual. The sultan, surrounded by eunuchs and concubines, isolated in his palace, making decisions about provinces he'd never seen, people he'd never met. The machinery of governance becoming so complex, so layered with bureaucracy, that no single mind could comprehend it. And in that incomprehension, a kind of paralysis, orders issued but not followed, laws written but not enforced, the whole system running on momentum, like a wheel spinning after the hand has let go. Why do empires collapse the moment they believe they cannot? Because belief shapes reality more than we want to admit. When a civilization stops questioning itself, stops doubting its foundations, stops wondering if the thing that worked yesterday will work tomorrow, that's when the structure begins to hollow out. Montesquieu understood that confidence and decadence were two sides of the same coin. A people secure in their greatness stop doing the things that made them great. They rest on the accomplishments of ancestors. They tell themselves stories about inherent superiority, divine favor, manifest destiny. And those stories become a kind of blindness. But there's another layer here, something darker and more intimate. Montesquieu noticed that the collapse of belief didn't happen all at once. It happened in phases, like a marriage dying. First comes the quiet disappointment, the realization that the ideals you were taught don't match the world you inhabit. Then comes cynicism, that corrosive acid that eats through civic virtue. Why serve the Republic when the Republic serves only the powerful? Why honor the law when the law is a tool of oppression? And finally comes the silence, the withdrawal, the internal exile where citizens stop participating and start surviving. He wrote about this in letters to friends, in passages that never made it into his published works. He described walking through Paris and feeling like a ghost among ghosts. People going through the motions of civilization without believing in the motion. The rituals of governance performed without conviction. The theater of power staged for an audience that had stopped watching. And he wondered, in those moments, if decline was even reversible. If once a people had tasted the comfort of not caring, they could ever return to the difficult work of vigilance. The answer, he suspected, was no, not without crisis, not without the kind of catastrophe that strips away illusion and forces a population to confront what they've become. But even then, even in the aftermath of collapse, there was no guarantee of renewal. Sometimes the lesson learned is only that survival is enough, that rebuilding to the same height is impossible, that the age of greatness is over, and what remains is merely the long, slow management of decline. Montesquieu never said this explicitly, but you can feel it beneath his prose. The melancholy of a man who sees clearly and can do nothing with what he sees. He wasn't a revolutionary. He didn't believe in tearing down and starting over. He believed in reform, in gradual adjustment, in the possibility that a society could correct itself if enough wise men spoke loudly enough. But history kept proving him wrong. The societies he studied didn't reform. They fractured, they imploded, they were conquered, consumed, or simply faded into irrelevance. And yet he kept writing. 14 years on the spirit of the laws, thousands of pages examining how climate shapes government, how commerce shapes culture, how religion shapes law. All of it an attempt to create a manual for survival, a guide to help future generations avoid the patterns he'd identified. He wanted to believe that knowledge could change trajectory, that if people understood the mechanisms of decline, they could resist them. But sitting here now, centuries later, with his words still echoing through political philosophy, we have to ask, did it work? Did his warnings prevent any collapses? Or did they simply give us a vocabulary for understanding our own decline as we experience it? Maybe that's enough. Maybe the role of the prophet isn't to prevent the fall, but to name it, to stand at the edge and say, clearly and calmly, this is what's happening. This is what it looks like when a civilization stops believing in itself. And in the naming, in the acknowledgement, something shifts. Not salvation exactly, but a kind of awareness that makes the fall less bewildering. We know the pattern now. We recognize the symptoms. And maybe, in that recognition, there's a sliver of dignity. The dignity of going down with open eyes, understanding exactly what we've lost and why we lost it. Why do empires collapse the moment they believe they cannot? Because certainty is the opposite of vigilance. Because the moment you stop watching the foundation is the moment the cracks begin to spread. And because in the end, all empires are sustained not by their strength, but by the collective agreement to believe in that strength. When the agreement breaks, when the story stops working, the structure follows, not slowly, suddenly, like a staircase whose rot went unnoticed, until the moment of the fall. Third exploration: what happens to freedom when it's no longer worth the trouble? There's a transaction that happens in the soul, mostly unnoticed, where a person trades one thing for another without quite realizing the exchange is permanent. Montesquieu saw this transaction everywhere he looked, in the citizens of republics who stopped attending assemblies because the debates felt pointless, in the merchants who accepted bribes because everyone else was doing it, in the soldiers who fought for wages instead of country. He saw freedom being sold, not dramatically, not in some grand moment of surrender, but quietly, in small increments, like coins dropped through holes in a pocket. And what troubled him most wasn't the selling. It was the buyer's remorse that never came. The way people adjusted to their new lightness and forgot they'd ever carried anything heavier. What happens to freedom when it's no longer worth the trouble? It doesn't disappear all at once. It becomes inconvenient first. A burden, something that requires too much time, too much energy, too much constant attention. Freedom, real freedom, is exhausting. It means you have to think for yourself, act for yourself, defend yourself. It means you can't blame anyone else for your circumstances. It means you're responsible not just for your own life, but for the character of the society you inhabit. And that responsibility, that weight, eventually feels like too much. Montesquieu understood this because he lived in a world where most people had never tasted freedom and didn't miss it. The peasants in the countryside, the servants in the great houses, the soldiers in the king's army. They weren't yearning for self-governance. They were yearning for predictability, for someone to tell them what to do and when to do it, for the comfort of knowing their place in a hierarchy that felt, if not just, at least stable. Freedom was an abstract concept, something philosophers debated in salons. Security was concrete. Security was bread and shelter, and the reasonable certainty that tomorrow would look like today. But here's where it gets complicated. Montesquieu also saw that the people who had known freedom and lost it suffered differently. They carried a ghost inside them, a memory of what it felt like to speak without permission, to assemble without surveillance, to dream without limits. And that ghost made them dangerous. Not rebellious necessarily, just restless, dissatisfied in a way that couldn't be soothed by bread and circuses. They knew what they'd traded away, even if they couldn't quite articulate it. And that knowledge made them either bitter or broken. He wrote about this in the context of Rome, how the Republic died not in a single assassination, but across generations of creeping autocracy. How the citizens who remembered the old ways became fewer and fewer, until finally there was no one left who could recall what it meant to be free. The empire offered something else instead: glory, wealth, entertainment, the satisfaction of being part of something vast and powerful. And for most people, that was enough. More than enough. Freedom was a luxury for philosophers. The empire was real. But Montesquieu wasn't interested in judging the exchange. He was interested in understanding it. Why does freedom lose its appeal? What changes in a population that makes security feel more valuable than autonomy? And what he found was this: freedom requires virtue, and virtue requires discomfort. You have to care about the common good more than your private comfort. You have to be willing to sacrifice, to argue, to stand up when standing up might cost you something. And the moment a society becomes too comfortable, too wealthy, too distracted, virtue starts to feel like an affectation, like something your grandfather talked about. But that doesn't really apply anymore. He saw it happening in his own time. The French aristocracy living in absurd luxury while the peasants starved. The court at Versailles performing elaborate rituals of power while the country's debt mounted. The intellectuals writing brilliant critiques that changed nothing. Everyone playing their assigned role in a system that was obviously unsustainable, but that felt, day to day, perfectly normal. And the freedom that had once defined the French spirit, that fierce independence, that refusal to bow, was quietly being traded for the privilege of staying comfortable just a little while longer. What happens to freedom when it's no longer worth the trouble? It becomes a story, a myth, something people invoke in speeches, but don't actually practice. The forms remain, the assemblies, the elections, the documents, but the substance drains away. And in that hollowing out, something else takes its place. Not always tyranny, sometimes just administration, bureaucracy, the management of complexity. 1,000 rules and regulations that make life feel both safer and smaller. You can't do this. You must do that. And slowly, without anyone quite noticing, the space where freedom used to live fills up with procedure. Montesquieu never lived to see the French Revolution, but he would have recognized it. The explosion that comes when too many people wake up at once and realize they've been robbed, not by force, but by their own acquiescence, by 1,000 small surrenders that seemed reasonable at the time. And the violence that follows? That's not just about overthrowing tyrants. It's about punishing yourself for having been complicit, for having let it happen, for having chosen comfort over courage. But even then, even in revolution, freedom is hard to resurrect, because the habits of servitude run deep, the instinct to look for someone to follow, someone to blame, someone to solve the problems that feel too large to solve alone. Freedom asks you to be large, to take up space, to believe your voice matters. And after years of making yourself small, of fitting into the spaces power has designated for you, that largeness feels impossible, feels dangerous, feels like something that could get you killed. So what happens to freedom when it's no longer worth the trouble? It waits, in books, in memories, in the stubborn hearts of people who refuse to forget what it felt like. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it finds its way back. Not because people suddenly become braver or wiser, but because the alternative becomes unbearable. Because comfort reveals itself as a cage. Because security without dignity is just another form of death. Montesquieu understood this, that freedom is not a natural state. It's a choice, renewed daily, requiring vigilance and sacrifice and the willingness to be uncomfortable. And that the moment a people forget this, the moment they start to think freedom is a given, an inheritance that maintains itself, that's the moment it begins to slip away. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like water through cupped hands. Until one day, you reach for it and find you're holding nothing but air. Fourth exploration. Can a mind that studies power ever remain innocent? There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with seeing too clearly. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the kind that settles in when you've spent too long watching how the machinery works. When you've traced the invisible threads that pull at human behavior, at laws, at the rise and stumble of nations. Charles-Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, knew this loneliness. He carried it through the halls of Bordeaux's parliament, through the salons of Paris, through 20 years of scribbling observations that would outlive empires. But here's what haunts me about him, what I think about when the night grows still. Once you truly understand how power moves through the world, can you ever look at anything the same way again? Can you ever be innocent of that knowledge? Montesquieu wasn't supposed to be a philosopher. He inherited a position as a magistrate, a seat of minor nobility, the kind of life already written for him before he could hold a pen. His days were meant to be predictable. Court sessions, land management, the quiet administration of justice in a sleepy corner of France. But something happened to him in those early years. Something that shifts a man's trajectory without him fully realizing it at the time. He began to notice patterns, the way certain laws worked beautifully on paper, but crumbled in practice. The way power accumulated not through grand declarations, but through 1,000 small compromises, each one barely visible until you stepped back and saw the shape they formed together. He started writing in secret. Not grand treatises at first, but observations, little mockeries of the world he inhabited. His first major work, The Persian Letters, was published anonymously because what he'd written was dangerous. Not in the way of treason, but in the way of truth told slant. He'd created fictional Persian travelers writing home about the strange customs of France. And through their foreign eyes, he revealed the absurdities of his own culture, the vanity of the church, the theatrical cruelty of absolute monarchy, the way people convinced themselves that their suffering was somehow noble or necessary. It was satire, yes, but satire born from genuine bewilderment at how easily people accepted their chains. What changes in a man when he spends his days watching injustice dressed up as order? When he sees how power doesn't corrupt suddenly, like a lightning strike, but gradually, like water wearing down stone? Montesquieu began to carry a weight that comes with this kind of seeing. He traveled across Europe, England, Italy, Germany, not as a tourist, but as a student of governance. He sat in courtrooms, he walked through prisons, He interviewed merchants, aristocrats, clergymen. He was trying to understand something essential: why some societies flourished while others devoured themselves. Why some laws protected dignity while others crushed it. Why freedom seemed so fragile, so easily lost, even by people who claimed to love it. In England, something shifted in him. He watched their parliament, their separation of powers, the way authority was deliberately fractured so no single hand could hold all the reins. It wasn't perfect. He saw that clearly, but it was different. It was designed with suspicion baked into its architecture, a system that assumed people in power would always want more, and so it built walls within walls to slow them down. He realized that innocence about power wasn't just naive, it was dangerous. The most elegant tyrannies were built by people who genuinely believed they were benevolent, that they alone could be trusted with absolute authority because their intentions were pure. Back home, Montesquieu spent nearly 2 decades writing what would become the spirit of the laws. The work nearly destroyed him. He went partially blind from the strain, squinting at manuscripts by candlelight, dictating passages when he could no longer see the page. Why pour yourself into something like that? Why sacrifice your health, your comfort, your peace? Because once you understand the mechanics of oppression, once you've seen how freedom dies, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow erosion of principles, one exception at a time, you can't simply look away. You carry a responsibility, whether you wanted it or not. The book was banned, of course, placed on the Catholic Church's index of forbidden books. Too dangerous, they said. But what made it dangerous wasn't advocacy for revolution or violence. It was something quieter and more subversive. The patient, methodical demonstration that power needs to be limited, not because rulers are evil, but because concentrated power inevitably corrupts even the well-intentioned. That liberty isn't a gift from the state, but a fragile equilibrium that requires constant vigilance to maintain. That the price of freedom is eternal discomfort with authority. Montesquieu never recovered his innocence, if he ever had it. He spent his final years aware that his greatest work was controversial, misunderstood, weaponized by people who'd read only fragments. But he'd done something that mattered. He'd mapped the terrain of power with such precision that anyone who read him carefully could never be fooled quite the same way again. He'd planted seeds of skepticism that would bloom in other minds, in Jefferson, in Madison, in every architect of systems designed to protect people from their own governments. There's a cost to this kind of knowledge. You can't unknow what power looks like when it stops pretending to be benevolent. You can't unsee the patterns once you've learned to recognize them. But maybe that's the point. Maybe wisdom isn't about remaining innocent. Maybe it's about accepting the weight of understanding, about carrying the discomfort of clear sight, about knowing that the world is held together by more fragile threads than we'd like to believe, and choosing to tend those threads anyway in whatever small ways we can, until our own candle burns down. Fifth exploration. What did the Baron whisper to himself in the hours no one was watching? There are things a man says in company, and then there are things he admits only to himself in the dark, in the gaps between what's expected and what's true. I think about Montesquieu in his study at the Château de la Brède, surrounded by his books and maps and half-finished manuscripts. And I wonder what he told himself when the visitors left, when the salons closed, when the performance of being a philosophe was done for the day. What did he really believe about the world he was trying to fix with words? The public Montesquieu, the one who circulated in Paris, who corresponded with intellectuals across Europe, who published careful arguments about the separation of powers, that Montesquieu had to be strategic. He lived under an absolute monarchy where ideas could be dangerous, where the wrong phrase could mean exile, or worse. But I suspect there was another Montesquieu, the one who existed only in private, who understood things he couldn't quite say out loud, even in his published works. The man who'd seen enough to know that most reforms fail, that most noble intentions curdle, that the world grinds on regardless of how elegantly you explain its flaws. He'd been born into privilege, which is its own kind of education. The title, the land, the expectation that he'd simply inherit a role in the existing order. These weren't things he earned. They were things that happened to him by accident of birth. And maybe that's what gave him perspective. He knew intimately that the system was arbitrary, that there was nothing inherently superior about the people at the top, nothing naturally subordinate about those at the bottom. He'd sat in rooms with kings and commoners, and he knew the secret that aristocracy tries to hide. That nobility is mostly theater, that power dresses itself up in ceremony and tradition to disguise the fact that it's ultimately just force with better costumes. But here's where it gets complicated, where I imagine Montesquieu alone with his doubts. He wasn't a revolutionary. He didn't believe in tearing everything down. He'd seen enough of history to know that chaos usually just reshuffles who's on top. It doesn't fundamentally change the game. So what do you do when you understand the system is unjust, but you also don't believe in the alternatives being proposed? When you're caught between a status quo you can't defend and a future you can't quite trust? I think he whispered this to himself, that politics is tragedy, not in the sense of inevitable doom, but in the Greek sense, that every choice forecloses other possibilities, that every system solves some problems while creating others, that there are no clean solutions, only trade-offs, compromises, and the eternal work of trying to make things slightly less terrible. He understood that you can't design a perfect government because you're working with imperfect materials, human beings with contradictory desires, competing goods that can't all be maximized simultaneously, and the uncomfortable fact that freedom for one person sometimes means constraint for another. His theory of climate and culture, which modern readers sometimes cringe at, reveals something about his private struggles. He argued that geography and climate shaped national character, that laws needed to be suited to the people and place they governed. It sounds deterministic, maybe even prejudiced by today's standards. But I think what he was really wrestling with was the question of whether universal principles even exist, whether the Enlightenment dream of discovering laws that work everywhere for everyone is achievable, or whether we're always building on shifting ground, adapting and improvising based on local conditions we can't fully control or transcend. Late at night, when the candles burned low, I believe he admitted to himself that most people don't want the freedom he was describing, that liberty is exhausting, that it requires constant vigilance, constant participation, constant discomfort. That, given the choice between freedom with responsibility and security with submission, most people choose security. He'd watched it happen. He'd seen how easily people traded their autonomy for the promise of protection. How quickly they accepted censorship if it meant not having to think too hard about uncomfortable truths. And maybe this was his deepest private fear, that everything he was writing would change nothing, that the spirit of the laws would be read by a few intellectuals, debated in salons, and then forgotten. While the world continued its usual dance of tyranny and resistance, empire and collapse, that human nature was too fixed, too predictable, too resistant to the lessons of history, that he was spending his vision and his health on a book that would ultimately be a beautiful failure. But he kept writing anyway. This is what haunts me about him, what I return to when I think about the solitude of understanding. He knew the odds were against him. He knew most reforms fail. He knew that power concentrates, that freedom erodes, that vigilance exhausts itself, that every generation has to relearn the same bitter lessons. And yet, he couldn't stop himself from trying to articulate a better way, from mapping out the principles that might help some future society avoid the worst mistakes. What did he whisper to himself? Maybe this, that the work matters even if it doesn't succeed, that bearing witness is its own form of resistance, that leaving a record of clear thought in a confused age is worthwhile, even if no one listens, that there's dignity in trying to understand, even when understanding brings no comfort, even when it isolates you from the people around you who've chosen easier certainties. He died in 1755, his eyesight nearly gone, his body worn down from decades of intense intellectual labor. His last years were spent defending his work, against critics who misunderstood him, against censors who feared him, against admirers who simplified him. But somewhere in those private hours, I think he made peace with the fact that he'd done what he could, that he'd spoken truths that needed speaking, even if they were incomplete, even if they were imperfect, even if they changed less than he'd hoped. The whispers in the dark don't need to be optimistic to be true.
Sixth exploration. Is there a price for understanding? What most men choose to ignore? There's a kind of knowledge that costs you something. Not money or time, but something subtler. Call it ease or belonging, or the comfort of living inside shared illusions. Montesquieu paid this price. Once you've truly studied how societies function, how power moves, how freedom gets lost in the slow accumulation of small surrenders, once you've seen all that with clarity, you can't participate in the casual conversations anymore. You can't nod along when someone says the system works. You can't pretend ignorance about the machinery grinding beneath the surface of normal life. This is the paradox of political wisdom. The more you understand governance, the harder it becomes to trust any government. The more you study history, the clearer it becomes that the patterns repeat. That human beings keep making the same fundamental errors. Knowledge doesn't save us, because knowledge isn't the problem. The problem is that we know what we should do, and we do something else anyway, because fear is stronger than wisdom, because short-term comfort beats long-term planning, because it's easier to blame others than to accept our own complicity. Montesquieu lived this paradox daily. He moved through French society as a nobleman, attending the requisite functions, playing the expected roles. But he was also documenting that society's flaws with surgical precision. He was the dinner guest who smiled politely while cataloging hypocrisies, the courtier who bowed to power while writing essays about why that power needed to be constrained. This kind of double consciousness wears on a person. You become a stranger in your own life, performing a role while simultaneously observing the performance. Never quite fully present, because part of you is always analyzing, always holding back, always aware of the gap between what people say and what's actually happening. The price isn't just personal discomfort, it's alienation. Once you understand how institutions perpetuate themselves, how laws serve certain interests while claiming neutrality, how language gets weaponized to make injustice sound reasonable. Once you see all that, you're separated from the people who don't see it. Not because you're better than them, but because you can't unhear what you've heard. You're living in a different reality, one where the official story doesn't quite make sense anymore, where you're constantly translating between what's said and what's meant. Montesquieu's contemporaries found him difficult. He was too skeptical for the monarchists, not radical enough for the revolutionaries. He criticized the church, but wasn't an atheist. He believed in law, but didn't trust lawyers. He argued for liberty, but thought most people weren't ready for it. This kind of nuanced thinking makes you unpopular. People want certainty. They want heroes and villains, clear sides, simple solutions. They don't want to hear that the problems are structural, that good intentions aren't enough, that the system is both necessary and corrupt, that there are no clean hands. But here's what I think about late at night. Maybe the price is worth it. Maybe there's something valuable in being the person who refuses to simplify, who insists on holding contradictions, who keeps asking uncomfortable questions, even when everyone else has moved on to easier conversations. Because someone has to remember. Someone has to maintain the institutional memory of how things go wrong, of what warning signs look like, of which compromises lead to catastrophe, and which ones are necessary evils. Montesquieu understood that freedom isn't natural. It's not the default state of human societies. The default is hierarchy, concentration of power, the strong dominating the weak and calling it order. Liberty has to be deliberately constructed, carefully maintained, constantly defended against erosion. And most people don't want to do that work. They want to believe that someone else, some benevolent leader, some wise counsel, some constitutional document, will protect their freedom for them. But that's the illusion that costs us everything. The man who sees this clearly pays for it in 1,000 small ways. He can't enjoy the patriotic speeches because he knows how nationalism gets manipulated. He can't trust the promises of politicians because he studied how power changes people. He can't participate in the collective fantasies that hold societies together. The myth of meritocracy, the fiction of justice, the comfortable lie that the system rewards virtue. He's awake when others are dreaming, and that wakefulness is isolating. Yet Montesquieu didn't retreat into cynicism. This is what I find remarkable about him, what makes his example worth contemplating as the night deepens. He understood the corruption and fragility of institutions, and he still argued for better institutions. He knew that power corrupts, and he still tried to design systems that might limit that corruption. He saw how often reforms fail, and he still spent decades crafting arguments for reform. That takes a particular kind of courage, not the courage of naive optimism, but the courage of clear-eyed persistence. There's a moment in every serious thinker's life when they have to decide, do I use this knowledge to withdraw, to protect myself, to become bitter? Or do I use it to engage more carefully, to work within the constraints of what's possible, to make small improvements knowing they won't be enough? Montesquieu chose engagement, not the loud, dramatic kind that gets remembered in revolutionary songs, but the patient, methodical kind that shows up day after day to document, to analyze, to propose, to hope, without expecting too much from that hope. The price for understanding what most men ignore is that you live with a weight others don't carry. You see the mechanisms, you feel the precariousness, You know how quickly civilization can unravel, how thin the ice is that we're all skating on. But the alternative, willful ignorance, comfortable delusion, the easy sleep of people who trust without questioning, that has its own price. It's paid later, often collectively, when the systems we didn't bother to understand finally collapse under their own contradictions. So maybe the question isn't whether there's a price for understanding. Maybe the question is, which price are you willing to pay? The discomfort of knowledge or the danger of ignorance? The loneliness of clear sight or the false comfort of shared blindness? Montesquieu made his choice. He paid with his health, his sight, his peace of mind. But he left behind a map, and sometimes in the dark that's enough. Sometimes knowing that someone else walked this path before you, that someone else bore the weight of understanding and didn't collapse under it. Sometimes that's what lets you carry your own burden one more day, one more thought, one more quiet act of witness, in a world that prefers its sleepers undisturbed. Seventh, exploration. What kind of silence falls over a man who sees the future in another empire's grave? There's a particular stillness that comes over certain men, not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of recognition. It's the kind that settles in when you've stood in the ruins of something that once believed itself eternal and felt, deep in your chest, the echo of your own world in those crumbling stones. Charles-Louis de Secondat stood in such places. The Baron de Montesquieu, they called him, though titles mean little to men who've learned to read the handwriting on history's walls. He walked through Rome when most men his age were content to walk through their own gardens. He saw the Forum, that great heart of an empire that had convinced itself it would never stop beating. And he felt something most tourists never feel. The cold recognition that every column, every archway, every weathered inscription was a prophecy written in reverse. You have to understand what it means to be a man who studies empires the way a doctor studies corpses. There's a clinical distance required, yes. But there's also an intimacy, a willingness to place your hand on cold stone and feel the absence of warmth, to reconstruct in your mind the moment when the blood stopped flowing. Montesquieu did this not with morbid fascination, but with the focused attention of someone who knows he's looking at a mirror, not a museum. He wandered through Italian cities where the bones of the Roman Republic lay beneath churches and marketplaces. The locals went about their business, buying bread, falling in love, arguing about money, all of it happening atop the wreckage of a civilization that had once stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. And in that contrast, that vertical layering of then and now, Montesquieu found his education. Because here's what happens when you truly see the pattern. You can't unsee it. You begin to notice the same cracks appearing in different stone, the same arrogance wearing different costumes, the same complacency speaking different languages. Rome fell, yes, but Rome also continues falling over and over in every empire that forgets what Rome forgot. He took notes. Not the dry academic kind, but observations that burned with a quiet urgency. He noticed how the Venetians, perched on their lagoon, had managed to preserve their republic for centuries through a paranoid genius. A system so intricate, so deliberately suspicious of human nature, that ambition itself became trapped in a maze of checks and counterchecks. Their longevity came not from trust, but from an architectural distrust, a government built like a puzzle box, where no single hand could grasp all the pieces. And he contrasted this with France, his France, where power pooled like standing water in the Palace of Versailles, where the Sun King's light cast such long shadows that men forgot what their own faces looked like. Montesquieu felt the danger in that forgetting. He felt it the way you feel a fever coming on. That subtle wrongness in the blood before the body understands it's sick. The silence that fell over him wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a man who's learned something he cannot unlearn, who's gained a sight he cannot close his eyes against. Walking through those Roman ruins, he was simultaneously in the past and in the future, seeing both the fall that had happened and the falls yet to come. And in the center of that double vision, he stood in his own present moment, a French nobleman in an age of absolute monarchy, feeling the ground beneath his feet begin its imperceptible shift. There's a weight to this kind of knowledge. It separates you. While other men debate the fashion of the season or the scandal of the court, you're listening to a deeper rhythm, the slow, geological grinding of systems against their own contradictions. You become like a physician who can diagnose terminal illness by the color of a man's eyes, by the way he holds his shoulder, by signs invisible to everyone else. Montesquieu returned to France changed. Not visibly. He still wore the powdered wig, still attended the salons, still played the role expected of a baron. But internally, something had shifted. He had acquired what might be called historical vertigo, that dizzying sensation of seeing your own moment not as fixed and inevitable, but as contingent, fragile, one possible arrangement among countless others. And so he began to write, but not with the hot urgency of a revolutionary or the cold certainty of a prophet. He wrote with the careful, measured attention of a man drawing a map in the dark, knowing that others would need it when the lights went out. The spirit of the laws would take him 20 years. 20 years of sitting in his study, surrounded by books on Rome, on England, on Persia, on tribes most Frenchmen had never heard of, trying to distill from all that variety some essence, some principle, that might help men understand why some societies flourish and others rot from within. The silence that falls over such a man is the silence of deep listening, not to voices, but to patterns, not to words, but to the spaces between them, where truth hides. It's the silence of someone who has placed his ear against the chest of history and heard, beneath all the noise of events and personalities, the steady, implacable rhythm of cause and consequence. And once you hear that rhythm, everything changes. You cannot walk through your own society as an innocent anymore. You see the small corruptions that will become large ones. You feel the subtle tilt toward tyranny in decisions that seem merely convenient. You recognize the moment when freedom stops being something men actively defend and becomes something they passively expect. And you know, with the cold certainty of a man who's seen this before, that such expectations are the first symptom of its disappearance. But before we leave this thought behind, there's one more silence worth listening to. The silence that comes not from seeing the fall, but from understanding the specific mechanism of the collapse, the precise point where the whole structure tips from salvageable to doomed. Eighth exploration. Where does the soul go when it realizes the law itself has become a weapon? There's a moment in every society's decline when language begins to betray itself, when the words that once protected you become the chains that bind you, when law, that beautiful fiction we created to make power answerable to reason, quietly transforms back into the naked force it was always meant to replace. Montesquieu understood this transformation with an almost painful clarity. He had seen it in the pages of Tacitus, in the histories of Rome's imperial period, when the same Senate that had once embodied republican virtue became a theater of compulsory applause. The laws remained, parchment and ink and elaborate procedure, but their spirit had fled like heat from a dying body. He knew what it felt like to live in such a time, to watch men use the vocabulary of justice to commit injustice, to see liberty invoked in the service of oppression, to witness the slow, careful process by which the instruments designed to constrain power become the very tools through which power expands itself. This is one of those truths that does something to a person when it fully arrives. It's not like learning a fact, that Rome fell in 476, that water boils at a certain temperature. It's more like watching the ground beneath your assumptions crack open, revealing that the solid earth you've been standing on was always just a thin crust over an abyss. Consider what it means when law stops being a shield and becomes a sword. When the elaborate machinery of courts and statutes and precedents continues to operate, perhaps more busily than ever. But somehow, the protection you thought you had has evaporated like morning mist. The forms remain, the rituals persist, but the substance has been hollowed out, replaced with something that merely wears the old costume. Montesquieu saw this happening in different ways across different societies. In some it was crude, the monarch simply declaring his will to be law, the ancient parchments be damned. But in others, and these interested him more, the transformation was subtle. The law remained, but its interpretation shifted. The same words came to mean different things depending on who spoke them. Justice became something that required the right connections, the right name, the right willingness to pretend you didn't see what was happening. He studied the Ottoman Empire with particular attention to this phenomenon. Here was a system where law, sacred law no less, existed in elaborate detail, but its application depended entirely on the whim of the Sultan and his officials. A man could be executed for a crime one day and rewarded for the same act the next, depending on nothing more substantial than the mood of power. The law existed, but it had become a tool rather than a constraint, a weapon rather than a shield. And he looked at France, his own France, and felt the cold fingers of recognition. The parlements, those courts that were supposed to check royal power, had become in many ways partners in its expansion. They used their authority to validate decisions already made in the palace. The process looked legitimate. The proper forms were observed. But something essential had been lost. What happens to the soul when it realizes this? When it understands that the beautiful architecture of justice it believed in was always, at some level, conditional. That the protection of law depends not on its written words, but on something far more fragile. The willingness of enough people to risk something when those words are violated. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with this understanding. You find yourself in conversations where people still speak about law and rights with the old certainty, the old faith, and you want to reach across the table and shake them awake. But you also know that the awakening itself carries a cost, that innocence, once lost, cannot be recovered, that to see clearly is sometimes to see oneself as helpless before forces too vast and too entrenched to resist. Montesquieu felt this. You can sense it in the careful, measured prose of the spirit of the laws. He's writing for people who still believe in the possibility of good government, rational law, the containment of arbitrary power. But underneath that measured tone, there's an awareness, a knowledge that he's writing instructions for a patient who may already be terminal, who may have already passed the point where knowledge can save them. He proposed separation of powers, that brilliant, desperate architecture where ambition would check ambition, where no single part of government could accumulate enough strength to devour the others. It was an admission, really, that you couldn't trust any individual or institution with concentrated authority. That human nature required not conversion, but containment. That the best you could hope for was a system where each wolf watched the others closely enough that none could feed without restraint. But what haunted him, what should haunt anyone who studies these things, was the recognition that even the best architecture could be undermined. That separation of powers worked only as long as the separate powers actually wanted to remain separate. The moment they discovered common interests in expanding their collective authority over the people they were meant to serve, all the elaborate machinery in the world couldn't stop them. The soul that realizes this enters a strange territory. It cannot return to simple faith in institutions. It cannot pretend that written constitutions are self-executing, that rules protect themselves. But neither can it surrender to cynicism, to the belief that all law is merely force dressed in prettier clothing. Instead, it finds itself in that uncomfortable middle ground, still believing in the necessity of law, still arguing for its proper structure and limits, but with the sad awareness that such arguments are themselves contingent, that they work only when enough people care enough to make them work, that there is no mechanism that cannot be broken, no protection that cannot be stripped away if the will to strip it exists, and the will to resist it doesn't. Montesquieu lived in this middle ground for decades. He wrote his careful analyses of different governmental forms. He praised the English Constitution with its checks and balances. He warned against despotism in all its guises. But always, beneath the scholarly tone, there was that deeper current of recognition that he was describing not inevitable outcomes, but fragile possibilities. That every good system was also a miracle, a temporary agreement among people who might at any moment decide they preferred the certainty of tyranny to the responsibility of freedom. And perhaps what happens to the soul in such circumstances is this: it learns to value the moment, to recognize that the protection of law, the constraint of power, the space for human dignity and choice, these are not natural states, but achievements, rare achievements, achievements that require constant maintenance and defense, that the ground beneath your feet is only as solid as the collective decision to keep it solid. But before we leave this thought behind, there's one more silence worth listening to. The silence that falls when you understand not just that empires fail, but that. Ninth, exploration. Can a man describe the architecture of cages without building one for himself? There's a particular danger in studying power too closely. Not the danger of corruption, though that exists, but something subtler and perhaps more insidious. The danger of becoming the thing you analyze, of letting the structures you map take root in your own thinking, until you can no longer imagine alternatives to them. Montesquieu spent his life describing systems of government with an anatomist's precision. He dissected republics and monarchies and despotisms, laying bare their internal mechanisms, their hidden gears and levers. He showed how climate shaped law, how geography influenced governance, how customs created the boundaries within which politics could operate. It was brilliant work, revolutionary work, work that would influence generations of constitution makers and political theorists. But there's a cost to such seeing. When you spend decades studying the machinery of power, you begin to think in terms of machinery. You start to see human societies as things that can be engineered, designed, optimized. You lose sight, or risk losing sight, of the wild, unruly, fundamentally unpredictable nature of human freedom. He was aware of this danger. You can feel it in the way he wrote, the constant hedging, the refusal to offer simple prescriptions. He wasn't writing a manual for building the perfect state. He was writing a warning about the difficulty, perhaps the impossibility, of doing so. But even in warning against it, he was creating the language and concepts that would allow others to attempt it. This is the paradox at the heart of political philosophy. To understand power, you must study its workings. But to study its workings, you must adopt a certain distance, a certain coldness, that treats human beings as units in a system, rather than as the wild, contradictory, infinitely variable creatures they actually are. You must simplify in order to understand. But every simplification is also a cage, a reduction of possibility to pattern. Montesquieu knew this. He had read Machiavelli, that other great anatomist of power, and seen how that clear-eyed analysis could be used to justify anything, to excuse everything. He had seen how knowledge of manipulation could become indistinguishable from manipulation itself, how the description of tyranny could become a handbook for tyrants. So he tried to build safeguards into his own work. He emphasized that different societies required different forms of government, that there was no universal template, that the English Constitution, which he admired, would be a disaster if imported wholesale to France. That good government required not just the right structures, but the right spirit, that intangible quality of virtue or honor or fear that animated the structures and gave them life. But even these safeguards carried their own dangers, because if different societies require different governments, who decides which society requires which government, and on what basis? The risk is always that such judgments become exercises in justifying the status quo, explaining why the powerful deserve to be powerful, why the subjugated must remain subjugated, why change is dangerous, and the existing order, for all its flaws, is the best we can manage. This is the cage that the analyst can build for himself without realizing it. The cage of sophisticated resignation, of seeing so clearly how things work that you become convinced they cannot work differently, of understanding the obstacles to change so thoroughly that the obstacles begin to seem like natural laws rather than human choices. Montesquieu struggled against this his entire life. He wrote with urgency about the dangers of despotism. He warned that liberty required constant vigilance. He emphasized that no system could maintain itself without the active participation of citizens who understood its workings and cared about its preservation. He was not counseling resignation. He was counseling awareness. But awareness has a way of curdling into fatalism if you're not careful. When you've seen enough empires fall, enough constitutions fail, enough noble experiments collapse into tyranny, it becomes easier to believe that such outcomes are inevitable, that human nature is fixed, that the same patterns will repeat forever, because we are what we are and cannot be otherwise. This is the deepest cage, the one built not from bars, but from pattern recognition, from the belief that because something has always happened, it must always happen. That history is not a series of contingent choices, but an unfolding logic, inexorable and immune to human will. And yet Montesquieu kept writing. For 20 years, he worked on the spirit of the laws, knowing it might change nothing, knowing the forces he described were larger than any book could contain. Why do such a thing? Why describe the architecture of cages if you cannot break them? Why map the mechanics of power if that power will remain unmoved by your mapping? Perhaps because the cage becomes real only when we accept it as inevitable. Perhaps because the act of description itself is a form of resistance, a refusal to let power operate in darkness, to let tyranny pretend it is natural, to let oppression wear the mask of necessity. Or perhaps there's something simpler at work. Perhaps the man who studies power too closely builds a cage for himself. But perhaps he also leaves the door open. Perhaps he leaves behind the key in the form of his writings, his warnings, his careful documentation of how these systems work and where they fail. Perhaps he trusts that others, reading in different times with different eyes, will see possibilities he could not. The danger is real. The more you study the architecture of cages, the more you risk becoming their builder, their maintainer, their apologist. But the alternative, to refuse such study, to remain innocent of power's workings, is to guarantee that the cages will be built anyway, just by people with less care for the human souls they will contain. Montesquieu chose to look, to see clearly even when clarity brought pain, to describe honestly even when honesty offered no solutions. He lived in the tension between knowledge and action, between understanding how things work and believing they might work differently. He built no cage for others, though he provided the materials from which cages might be built. And in doing so, he also provided the materials for their dismantling. The question lingers, though, in the quiet spaces of the night. When the books are closed and the candles burn low, can we describe the world as it is without making it more difficult for the world to become what it might be? Can we see clearly without losing faith? Can we understand the machinery of power without becoming mechanical ourselves? These were Montesquieu's questions. They remain ours. And in the space between question and answer, in that uncertain territory where knowledge meets hope and experience meets possibility, we find ourselves still walking in his footsteps. 10th exploration. What does a thinker feel the first time he realizes the throne is empty? There's a feeling that comes over a person when they realize that what they once believed to be solid is actually made of air. Not the shock of betrayal exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that arrives slowly, like frost forming on a window pane while you sleep. Montesquieu felt this, not all at once, not in a single moment of revelation, but gradually, over years spent moving through the corridors of French nobility, watching men in powdered wigs argue over privileges that existed only because everyone had agreed to pretend they did. He watched kings who governed by divine right, and saw how that divinity seemed to flicker whenever the treasury ran low. He observed magistrates wielding authority passed down through bloodlines and noticed how often that blood had grown thin, how frequently the inheritance was just a title with nothing beneath it. The throne, he began to understand, was a chair. The crown was metal. The scepter was wood. And the power was something else entirely. Something that lived in the collective agreement of thousands of people, who could, at any moment, simply stop agreeing. This is not a comfortable realization for a man born into the world that agreement built. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The emperor's nakedness becomes impossible to ignore, and you're left standing there, still dressed in the clothes of the old world, wondering what happens next. He began to write, not manifestos, not revolutionary pamphlets, just observations, careful, measured thoughts about why some governments endure and others crumble, about the nature of laws and the relationship between climate and character, between commerce and liberty. He wrote the way a cartographer draws maps of territories he knows others will eventually need to navigate. He wrote because once you've seen the emptiness behind the throne, you have a choice. You can pretend you didn't. Or you can try to understand what fills that space when pretending stops working. There's a passage in his work where he describes despotism, and the language is almost gentle. He doesn't rage against tyrants. He simply describes the ecosystem of fear that sustains them, the way subjects learn to monitor their own thoughts, to police their own expressions, to become their own jailers. And underneath that description, you can feel something else, a sadness maybe, or a kind of exhausted recognition. Because he's not just talking about distant lands or ancient empires. He's talking about the human heart and what it learns to do when it lives too long under the weight of someone else's will. The first time a thinker realizes the throne is empty, they're also realizing something about themselves, that they too have been participating in the illusion, that they've been bowing to air and calling it authority. And there's a loneliness that comes with that understanding, the loneliness of being awake while others still dream. But Montesquieu didn't stop there. He didn't just diagnose the emptiness. He tried to imagine what could fill it. Not one person, not divine right or inherited wisdom, but something more fragile and more powerful, a system of balanced forces, each checking the other, each preventing any single will from claiming the throne absolutely. He envisioned government as a kind of ongoing conversation, a negotiation that never ends, because ending it would mean allowing someone to declare themselves the final word. This was radical without sounding radical. It was revolution whispered in the language of philosophy. Because if the throne is empty, if power is not a substance but a relationship, then everything changes. The question is no longer who should rule, but how do we arrange things so that no one can rule absolutely? And late at night, in his study, with the fire burning low and the candle guttering in its own wax, do you think he felt the weight of that question? Do you think he understood that he was helping to midwife a world where his own class, his own inherited privileges, would eventually lose their grip on the collective imagination? There's a courage in that. Not the courage of the battlefield, but something quieter. The courage to keep thinking even when your thoughts threaten to unmake the world you were born into. The courage to describe the emptiness, even when you know that others, reading your words decades or centuries later, will use them to dismantle thrones you never thought to challenge. And maybe that's what a thinker feels the first time they realize the throne is empty. Not just the shock of discovery, but the vertigo of responsibility. Because once you know, once you've put that knowledge into words, it begins to live in the world independently of you. It whispers to others. It plants seeds in soil you'll never see. It changes things. The room grows quiet. The fire settles into embers. The candle flickers one last time before the darkness gathers close. And somewhere, in that darkness, The old certainties continue their slow dissolution, making room for whatever might come next.